Welcome to EPG Pathshala. The module I'll be covering is titled On Becoming a Social Worker, and the paper is Fieldwork and Fieldwork Supervision. I am the author, that is Vimla Nadkarni. I'll start with the learning objectives of this module. I'll be covering the concept of social work, what is the difference between a professional and non-professional social worker, the qualifying criteria and characteristics, roles and responsibilities of the social worker, values and attitudes for ethical practice, and challenges of becoming a social worker. To start with, very briefly, social work started as a profession abroad in the United States and the UK in the early 19th century, early 20th century, and we in India started the profession only in 1936 when the first social work school, that is the Sir Dorabji Tata School of Social Work, was initiated in Mumbai. So, social work in India has a long history, and in this module, while we are looking at social work history, we also need to understand what is the definition of social work. As a student, you have to understand that professional social work has evolved over time and moved from a very individual-oriented perspective to more of a systems-oriented perspective. So the latest international definition of social work, which was created by the International Association of Schools of Social Work and the International Federation of Social Workers in 2012, focuses on social work aiming to not merely uplift people or focus on their well-being, but the important aspects of interventions are aimed at protection of human rights, achieving social justice, equality, and of course, a better life for people, especially those who are marginalized, disadvantaged, exploited, and disabled. Social work, like any other discipline, while it's a helping profession, it is an academic discipline, and it embodies knowledge, theoretical knowledge, skills, and attitudes to work with people. The knowledge is based on theoretical understandings in the social, human, and environmental sciences. Social work skills that are taught to work with the poor, exploited, and disadvantaged people involve work with at the individual level, group level, community, institutional, and policy levels. And as I mentioned earlier, the principles underlying the teaching of social work and the practice of social work are the principles of social justice, human rights, collective responsibility, and respect for diversity. I will elaborate on each of these principles through the next few slides. Thus, the contents of the module will cover the concepts of social work and social worker, the qualifications, characteristics, roles and responsibilities, ethical practices and challenges, which are based on the learning objectives. How do we define a professional social worker? In very practical terms, a social worker is a person with a social work degree who is employed in a paid position and who undertakes social services and other activities aimed at improving the lives and well-being of the poor and to achieve social justice, empowerment, social harmony, and protection of human rights. So there is a dual focus on human well-being and structural systemic issues. The social worker works in a wide range of settings and with a wide range of stakeholders. Social workers work in open settings like rural or tribal or urban communities, in closed settings like schools, institutions, hospitals. Social workers may also work as staff of NGOs on issues like the environment, human rights, legal aid, and peace. The range is wide also in terms of the ideology of the organization, its vision and mission. For example, in some of the institutions, they may follow a very functional approach, which is only related to making improvements within the system itself. But there may be NGOs or organizations that work on more activist-oriented issues. So it will depend a lot on their ideology and the vision and mission that they adopt. We need to make a difference between the professional social worker and non-professional voluntary worker. There's a common feeling that everybody is a social worker. Even a political worker can be a social worker. Any housewife, any person with a charitable attitude of feeling of doing charity can be a social worker. But we distinguish between who is a professional and who is a voluntary social worker. So a voluntary social worker would be a philanthropist, a worker providing charity and material benefits, generally from social and religious organizations like Lions Club, Rotary Club, or could be also attached to a temple these days with Baba Ramdev or Satya Sai Baba's institutions. So they would belong to any of these organizations. Voluntary workers are part-time, regular. They may work as regular workers or based on their convenience when they have time available to them. Unlike a professional social worker who is paid by the organization and is expected to work full-time or as planned by the organization. NGOs may be run by non-professionals, by other professionals, by people from other disciplines. For example, a center can be run by a psychiatrist or a psychologist, and they may employ professionally trained social workers to be part of their team. At the same time, we have professional social workers who may volunteer and not get into paid jobs. They may do this for whatever reason, whether personal or otherwise, and they volunteer to be social workers either after retirement or even before retirement. And the volunteer can also become a paid professional after getting qualified. I mean, we have, for example, health workers from Niramay Health Foundation, which is an NGO working on health issues, who have gone into studying further after working with the organization for several years. They have felt confident to go into a degree program. So they have completed their bachelor's degree in social work, and some of them have even gone further to complete their master's degree and PhD degrees. And they now qualify as professional social workers. So one may differentiate between the qualified professional social worker and the volunteer social worker, but sometimes the line between them is very thin. So, what is the qualification of a social worker, and can we understand some of their characteristics of each other? What do we expect of them to, when they come in as social workers or when they come in for a qualification in social work? As I mentioned before, they must have a degree, either a bachelor's degree in social work or a master's degree in social work from a university or college which is recognized by the University Grants Commission. Social workers, uh, candidates who come in for a degree in social work, may be from any discipline as an undergraduate student. So you can come from a science stream, or students have come from, any other stream as an undergraduate student, psychology or economics, and they are eligible to enter. We've had engineers coming in for our program, we've had physiotherapists coming in for our program, even doctors. After they complete their MBBS, they want to change their professional line and they come in for the social work program. We generally find that the Bachelor of Social Work students, they go for a master's degree because they see the BSW as a foundation program. There are not many jobs available for BSW graduates in our country because it is still not a very popular program. I mean, it is not accepted in terms of jobs. Though there are some developments happening. What is the curriculum of our social work program in general? The curriculum includes foundation courses like the social sciences, core social work social sciences, which includes psychology, sociology, economics, and political science. In some of our programs, we also have environmental sciences because of the very symbiotic relationship between the environment and human well-being. So subjects on environment are also taught in some of the social work programs in our country. The core social work subjects would include history and philosophy of social work methods, social work ethics. In addition to the foundation courses and the core social work subjects, we have supportive or specialization subjects which direct the student to work with children or women based on their interest, working with disability, rural, urban community practice, criminal justice, Dalit and tribal social work, etc. So based on the area of interest that the student develops during the program, they are offered these specialization subjects. So what do we expect from a candidate who applies for admission to a social work program? What do we look for? We, of course, look for commitment and motivation to work with people. So, do the students have previous experience in voluntary social work? Would they be having good communication skills, good relationship skills, as well as deep interest in working with people, especially from the disadvantaged and low-income groups. We also look for sensitivity to social reality and social issues. Are they, are they in touch with what is happening around them? Are they in touch with the problems and issues that people are facing? Those in poverty, people are facing, maybe going through certain conflicts, mental health issues, and many other social issues. Women, for example, are they aware of the problems that women and young girls face in relation to violence and sexual abuse? Also, very important is their openness to learning. So we try to understand the students' capacity to learn, since there are theoretical courses, and the student should sort of feel confident enough to be able to relate to that theory. And of course, emotional and social maturity is very essential, because if a student is facing personal problems or problems in the family, then it would be more difficult for that student to become, a social worker and help people to solve their problems. There's a very common myth that sometimes students come for admission, they feel that if they do social work, they will be able to solve their personal problems. So they have, say, mentally challenged sibling, or they have mentally, disordered people in their family. So they believe that if they do the social work course, they will be able to solve those family problems. But it does not work like that, because working at a personal level is very different from working at a professional level. There are admission tests which try to assess the personality of the student. Of course, they are not 100% assured. We had, for example, in one of the colleges, a personality test being administered to students to assess their mental state, their emotional status. But despite that, sometimes the very emotionally immature students entered the course, so they are not fully 100% reliable. But there's a battery of tests which includes group discussion, central tests where questions are asked or an essay is asked, as well as the panel interview. So there are a range of ways that students are tested out to understand their eligibility for this course. Now, I could give my own example that when I joined social work, I really didn't understand what social work was all about, because I had done my graduation in psychology and I was not interested in going to a theoretical program at the master's level. So at the same time, I had done social work in a voluntary way in my own college, as well as my family had a background of helping people. Domestic workers who worked in our home were always supported to go in for education, to become more skilled so that they could get better jobs later, and they did not spend their entire life as domestic workers. So with this background, I decided to go in for the social work program. So students may not know a lot, though today with technology it is much easier to understand what social work is all about, what professional social work is all about. And students can come better prepared for the social work program. Going to the, what does a social worker do? What are their roles and responsibilities? They will vary with the job requirement. For example, when I worked as a medical social worker in the epilepsy clinic and later in the orthopedic center of a large public hospital, so I learned so much more about epilepsy, and as a social worker, I was also a researcher because this was a research and intervention program. So I had to work with people, do counseling, help them to understand what epilepsy is about, help them to, understand what the treatment is all about, parents coming with children and how parents would need to deal with children with epilepsy. What would be the status of adolescents when they, epilepsy affected them and affected their self-image. So there were a lot of new knowledge that I got, and I had to test out my skills in that clinic as well as my research knowledge. And for that, I had to, go back to my class notes, what I had studied in psychosocial aspects of illness and disease, and my research books to be able to work in an effective way. So what I'm trying to say is that that we learn on the job. We may not get everything. Now, epilepsy was not necessarily taught in my course at the master's level, but when I entered the program, I learned more about that condition. I was able to relate my theory to practice and practice to theory. The social workers thus have to do a range of tasks when they are working in different organizations. We have to demonstrate our role in whatever setting we work in. So as a hospital social worker, I was part of a multidisciplinary team. Even in the orthopedic center, I used to take ward rounds along with the other team members. The people who were living with paraplegia means those people who were paralyzed below the waist and they could not move. I was able to, convince the other team members like the physiotherapist, the occupational therapist to make home visits along with me to the home of a person living with paraplegia to be able to understand what kind of equipment would be suitable in that home environment. So, demonstrating one's role in a multidisciplinary team and working with other professionals is a very important role of a social worker. And the social worker plays multiple roles. For example, in the hospital, I was a researcher, I was a counselor, I was an advocate on behalf of the patients, and I was also orienting the hospital staff on what social work is all about. So, if we are looking at our practice within an integrated practice framework, then this is a framework which is very useful for doing practice, because it uses a systems approach in understanding the organization that we work with. We are change agents, so we are part of the change agent system. So the hospital where I was working would be, or the Department of Social Work where I was working, would be the change agent system. I am the change agent. And in the system, I identify who is the client system that I am serving as a social worker. So in the hospital, it's the patients who become part of the client system. I have to then understand who is the target system that needs to be influenced to better well-being, for better well-being for the patient, for better treatment of the patient. So in a hospital, I would have to work, I work with the doctors, the nursing staff, with the other assisting staff, the attendants, with the physiotherapist, the occupational therapist, with the psychiatrist, the mental health worker, and a range of people who were part of the treatment team and who were influencing the well-being of the patient. So if there were any problems with the target system, I would need to work with them. And by working with them, influence them to become part of the action system with me so that the treatment of the patient would become more effective. So taking other professional staff along with me for better observation of the patient in the home environment. So they become an action system with me for catering better to the health and well-being of the patient. The other example that I have taken here is of a children's home. A social worker is normally appointed as a probation officer or a welfare officer in a children's home or remand home, and is expected to assess the child's problem, interview the family and find out more about the child's problem and whether there are problems in the family that could have affected the child, interview the resident staff about the child, the behavior of the child, and observe the children and conduct recreational and therapeutic activities. And based on this investigation, the social worker makes a report to and presents it to the juvenile court, and thereafter decisions are taken. So within the residential institution, the social worker is working with the children involved in counseling, may use play and other recreational programs, and also liaison with the court and the legal system. So the role of the social worker is varied. Social workers are enablers, educators, catalysts, counselors, advocate, activists. They also get involved in activism, in policy change as researchers, and also administrators. They can be CEOs of an organization, they can be administrators of an organization, and thus they play a variety of roles at the individual level, the group level, the community level, the organizational level. This is very important for social work practice, because every social work practitioner must follow ethical system, and this is part of any profession. If you look at medical profession, you have an ethical code. In the social work profession, we have conscious use of values and principles which form the foundation of social work practice. And according to the International Statement of Ethics, ethical awareness is a fundamental part of the professional practice of social workers, and their ability and commitment to act ethically is an essential aspect of the quality of the service offered to those who use social work services. Ethical principles cover human rights, human dignity, social justice, and professional conduct. Going into each one in a little detail, let's take human rights and human dignity. This encompasses respecting right to self-determination, promoting the right to participation, treating each person as a whole, identifying and developing strengths. So each individual that we work with or group that we work with, we understand their capacity to make their own decisions. They should be participating and making decisions about their own life. We also treat the person as a whole, which means that looking at all aspects of the person, the physical, the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual, the well-being aspect. And human rights and human dignity also means that maintaining human dignity is identifying and developing strengths of the person, working with their potential. For the promotion of social justice, we challenge negative discrimination. So, there is discrimination in relation to gender, age, sexual orientation, caste, class, religion in our society. So, in order to be socially just, we have to challenge this form of discrimination against, say, for example, the higher caste oppressing the lower caste. To achieve social justice, we have to challenge this and recognize diversity in our population, that people are different, each one is unique, each group is unique. So we do not support racism, we do not support violence against ethnic groups or minority groups. Promoting social justice also means that we are ensuring equitable distribution of resources and challenging unjust policies and practices. So, unjust policies and practices that do not allow women, for example, to attain high positions. We find that it's if you sort of study the organizational system, you will find it's more male oriented than female oriented. So one has to change those policies and practice. There may be an unjust policy in relation to abortion or violence against women or dowry. So these policies and practices have to be challenged. And we work in solidarity for an inclusive society. So everybody is accepted as part of the society. Locals, immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, they would all be included. The higher caste, the lower caste, people from different religious groups, all part of that inclusive society. We, unfortunately, in our country, don't have as yet a code of ethics, and that is because we do not have a statutory council of professional social work like you have the Medical Council of India or the Nursing Council of India. The council which decides the quality of practice in the profession and the ethical code. However, there is a movement towards developing an ethics code and also working with the government to set up a statutory council of social work. So we have the NAPSWI. NAPSWI is the National Association of Professional Social Workers in India, which has in 2015 drafted a code of ethics and which provides principles and standards of ethical practice and ethical responsibilities, and these are given in detail in relation to the client, for example. So what is our ethical practice and responsibility towards our client? So how do we behave with a client? How do we maintain respect and dignity of the client? How do we not abuse a client? How do we ensure their welfare and well-being? These are put into the ethical code. With professional colleagues, ethical practices and responsibilities towards professional colleagues in terms of us relating to them, not putting anyone down, supporting them. Then self-employment. How do we practice ethics in self-employment? So if as a social worker I set up a counseling program on my own, or I set up an NGO, or I become a social entrepreneur, then I need to follow certain ethical practices, not cheating people, not making profits from the client. We also have practices related to education and supervision, research and its dissemination, then working with the self as a professional. So our own values, our biases, our prejudices, how do we control that when we are working with the client group and we are working with other stakeholders? Then profession itself, how does the profession itself maintain ethics? What are the penalties in case we have professionals who cheat people, who are corrupt? The practice setting itself, how does it maintain a practice ethics? The administration and management, so those who run the organizations also, there is a code of practice, and there's a code for the society at large. There are challenges and dilemmas which we face in ethical practice because of the conflicting interests. I gave the example of the remand home. The social worker makes investigation and then writes up a report. Now, how much of that confidential material should be, shared with the court is always a dilemma for the social worker. Then you have a practice in the community, ethical issues of practice in the community. The leaders are exploiting the people in the community. And as social workers, we want the people to be empowered so that they can work, on their own and not with an exploitative leader. How do they then recognize that? So social workers then, do come into conflict because there may be, different interests. So we are protecting the interests of people on the one hand with whom we work versus the societal demands. So in the process of development, for example, a road has to be built which is going through the slums. So slums are being evicted because of the development. And the social workers would be supporting the people in the slums against the eviction. And at the same time, there is demand for development. Trees being cut. Now roads are being built, the metros are being built and trees being cut. So these are dilemmas that constantly a social worker has to face. So besides the dilemmas, there are other challenges of becoming a social worker. It is an ongoing process during the period of study and employment. So it does not stop at the level of graduation, but it's a constant evolving process of becoming a social worker. For example, when I started my social work practice in the hospital, I was more confident of working with individuals and maybe small groups. It was later on when I uh, became a faculty in Nirmala Niketan College of Social Work that I really learned what community work is all about, and I was able to initiate a project, an urban health community project. So it's a continuous learning, and even during the period of employment. The challenge is also of working. We are constantly working with people who are oppressed, who are facing problems, who are being exploited, who are poor, facing social injustices, and human rights violations. So we have to be very resilient. Social workers have to become very resilient and strong to be able to constantly face these problems. And of course, there are periods when there is frustration, feeling of frustration, there's feeling of helplessness. Oh, the government is not responding. Oh, why are the people being evicted? They are not given an alternate shelter. Where will they go now? So that is also a very major challenge of how, as social workers, we develop strengths to face these frustrations and a sense of helplessness. The other challenge is that we always want concrete results. So it's like a doctor treating a patient feels so satisfied when the patient feels well. So how does a social worker get that feeling of satisfaction and motivation? If we talk of behavior change, it takes a long time to change behavior of people. But if we are looking at housing or shelter, even getting housing or shelter takes a long time because we have to constantly negotiate with different kinds of people in the government and outside the government. So that is a challenge of how do we get satisfaction and motivation even when the results are very abstract. As I mentioned earlier, we all need to work together as social workers, join associations, use various platforms for sharing practice and research data, and advocate for a statutory social work council. And this is because of the challenge that professional social workers always complain that they don't get recognition. They are not being recognized like other professionals. So in order to be recognized, we need to come together. We need to come together in solidarity and share our practice. We need to showcase what we are doing as social workers to be able to receive that recognition wherever we practice. So to summarize this module, we started with understanding a little history of social work abroad and in India, and the process of becoming a social worker. We discussed about social work eligibility, students, how candidates become eligible for social work, what are the characteristics, what are the features that we expect, what we want from them, as well as the roles and responsibilities of social workers working in different practice settings with a range of ideologies, vision, and mission. Also, stress the importance of ethical practice and the need for a code of ethics, as well as discuss the challenges that social workers face in the process of becoming social workers and working in different fields. So students, there are references for this module. Please look up the e-text for those references. There are also links to different write-ups and references. And wish you all the best, and thank you for your patient listening.